one of the things that really changed during the period of Mongol domination in Koryo history is foreign trade. Of course, the Song state with which Koryo had enjoyed very good commercial relations was gone. It was also absorbed into, conquered by the Mongol Empire. The Jurchen had lost their treasured position as middleman. This didn't mean, however, that trade and commercial relations in late Koryo were less than the period before, rather the opposite. And I think it's a number of Koryo's most important trading partners no longer existed, at least not in terms of them being independent, but something else replaced the presence of independent states with which Koryo, or communities with which Koryo traded. And that's the notion of the Pax Mongolica, the large cosmopolitan empire that came into being and that made it possible to maintain frequent commercial relations with a much bigger part of the world than before. And also in a way that was not as dangerous as it had been before because of the strong grip the Mongol authorities, in whatever guise, exercised on their empire. So this is a period, for example, that we see the Koryo government actually invest in international traders. They make it possible for international traders and for Koryo traders to actively export, for example, what you see here, Koryo porcelain. And Koryo porcelain was then and still is world famous for its uniquely greenish-blue celadon color. This is not something that just came about. This is something that was made possible by the new circumstances in which the Koryoans found themselves, and the proactive even attitude of the government with regard to long-distance trade. So during the period of Mongol domination, so the late 13th and 14th centuries, Koryo had active commercial connections with many other parts of the world. This was, however, not a one-way street. It was definitely a two-way street. On the one hand, Koryo traders visited places they perhaps had not been before or had not been able to visit very easily. And this is perhaps the reason, or perhaps the way, how Koryo came to be known as a state outside of Korea, outside of Northeast Asia, outside of East Asia, and which is why we still call the Korean Peninsula Koryo, or at least a derivative form of Koryo, Korea, or Kore, or whatever version of that word. Koryo also was visited more frequently than before, mainly by Central and West Asian individuals and traders. And this, of course, had its own influence on the Koryo outside, on the world outside of Koryo. And whether it's these visitors that spread the word about Koryo when they returned home or went to other places, or whether it's the Koryo trades themselves, we don't know. It's hard to say. What we do know is that trade seems to have been very lively during this period. This did mean, however, that if you want to maintain long-distance trading relations, it's not easy. It requires a number of things to make it work. One of those things is capital. Well, the Koryo government was at times willing to lend traders that capital, but it's more. It also requires reliable and safe transportation methods. It also requires ways of communication with people from other regions. What we see here is that the people who manage to successfully cross what used to be frontiers and which in the larger Yuan Empire and Mongolian Empire no longer are frontiers, is that they not just operate as merchants but also as messengers. They bring news, they bring new ideas, they bring all kinds of inventions and achievements to Koryo and from Koryo to the world. And that's one of the most important aspects of Koryo's presence, forced nonetheless in the Mongol Empire. Now, in the previous lecture I discussed the presence of a seemingly stable and prosperous group of Muslim traders from the Arab world. And this community, we're not entirely sure whether this is continuity between this community and the community you find in the 13th and 14th centuries, which are also Muslim and with an Arab background. But what is clear is that Arab traders, Muslim traders in late Kodio are doing well. People know about Kodio, and they could have known, they did know about Silla even before. But perhaps one of the most famous historians of the period, especially of what the Mongols did, Rashid al-Din, a Muslim geographer, historian, chronicler, writes about Korea, and his knowledge seems accurate and up to date. He even uses the name Kaoli, which is the Chinese pronunciation of Kodio, and he's the first one really who has seen or understands that the previous dynasty, Silla, no longer exists. By that time hasn't existed for 400 years or so. And in his account of the Yuan Empire, he writes that the empire of Yuan consists of 12 provinces, and one of those is Kaoli, Kodio, which I guess is also an indication of Kodio's special position within the Yuan Empire. Now, I have to admit that much is still unknown about the Muslim, Arab, merchant communities in Kodio. This is not something which was a matter of priority for the compilers of the most important sources on the Kodio period that we have, the Kodio-san and Kodio-san Chojo, which were compiled during the Choson period, early Choson period. This was not one of their priorities. So I can imagine that like with information on Buddhism, which was also not one of the priorities of the Neo-Confucian compilers of the Kodio-san and Kodio-san Chojo, much information has been lost. But there are some tantalizing clues that this community was well established. It had been there for a long time and was well integrated into Kodio's society without necessarily completely assimilating into it. Because if one thing is clear, is that the Muslim community in medieval Korea remained a Muslim community, and it remained able to, for example, select its own religious leader, which is a big thing that is not necessarily a given. And this remains all the way, this remains the case until the early 15th century, when the reasons for this are not entirely clear to me, but when under King Sejong of the Choson period, this changes, and the Muslim society community in Choson is basically forced to assimilate into Choson culture. Now, this, if anything, shows that the Muslim community in late Kodio was strong. If it wasn't strong, there's no need for Sejong to address the issue at all. There's no need to force Muslims to assimilate, because a small, weak community would have been assimilated anyway. But this is where many of the this is basically where the recognizable presence of a Muslim, of an identifiable Muslim community ends. But it is important to notice here that this community was present in Silla, was present in early Kodio, middle Kodio, and really probably grew in late Kodio under the circumstances of a cosmopolitan Yuan Empire, of which Kodio had become a part, which made it much easier to travel and to also trade in relative safety. So you can imagine that in the 10th or 11th century, it would have been an incredible adventure, probably, as a trader from the Arab Peninsula to trade with Kodio, or to go there and to relocate there. And it would still have not been very easy, I imagine, in the late 13th or 14th century, but the entire background and context had changed. It made it easier, and I would surmise that what we probably, if we would have the numbers, we would have seen a growth of Muslim traders, or the Muslim society in general. It would not have been only traders in late Kodio. And I mentioned this in a previous lecture as well, but the fact that there are traces in Koryo culture, in Koryo common culture, that point to the a normal presence of Muslim communities in Koryo that tells us a lot about the strength of this community. Like the Turkish bakery song, the Sangwajom, is one of the things that points, one of the indications that this was indeed the case. But important here again is the fact that this could take place against the background of a cosmopolitan Yuan empire. With all its drawbacks, it wasn't exactly a completely free society, but especially in terms of trade, much was possible that had not been possible before. Now, in order to properly, I think, contextualize this lecture, it's important that, to have a number of keywords and to keep them in mind. It's a slightly longish list, but first of all, I think we should start probably with the fact that Koryo had been made part of the Mongol Empire, and when that was basically fell apart in 4 different sections, Koryo became part of Yuan China. One of the most obvious and clear effects, consequences of the Pax Mongolica, so the period of sustained and enforced peace within the Mongol Empire, even after it split into 4 different parts, although it was necessarily slightly less than, was the international trade, and the way long-distance trade was made possible when before wasn't impossible, it was much more difficult. And this is directly connected to the notion of international exchange. This is a period in which ideas can travel from Koryo, from Kaegyong, all the way to Venice, if you will. And this is, of course, almost the journey that somebody like Marco Polo made. And he made much of his journey. If he would have to make that same journey today without the Pax Mongolica, he would need I don't know how many visas and passport stamps and everything. And that time he just needed one of the, well, so-called passports from the Mongol Empire, in which the Khan gave him free passage through the empire all the way to the capital. So it's this notion of exchange in a very cosmopolitized, internationalized environment that makes merchants, and that's the next keyword, act as messengers, as conveyors of new ideas, as conveyors of news. Now this is a very concrete consequence also for Koryo, because the Muslims in Koryo, the Muslim community in Koryo, mainly of Arab extraction before the Mongol invasions and absorption of Koryo into the Mongol Empire, the community seems to grow and become much stronger. And it's probably added to by, for example, Uyghur, Muslims of Uyghur extraction. And this is reflected in several things, but for example, in its presence in Koryo popular culture. Songs are made about the presence of the Turkish bakery. And it's not seen as something in the song strange or exotic. It's just noted it's a Turkish bakery. Which tells you something about the place and this community had by that time for probably a long time within Koryo. And finally, this is not something that is knowledge of which was restricted to the Korean Peninsula. The internationalized environment also made it easier for intellectuals outside of Koryo to know about Koryo, which is why in Rashid al-Din's work, Koryo is described as what it is, part of the Yuan Empire, and it's called by its proper name, Chinese pronunciation, perhaps, but still Kaoli, Koryo. So with that, I think with a strong emphasis on the importance of the internationalized environment in which Koryo found itself, and at the same time with an admonition, if you will, to not exaggerate the internationalized nature of the new situation, because Koryo has never been an isolated country. It traded with different nations before, but still this is a different kind of environment, and it did have its consequences in terms of the influence that foreigners could have on Koryo society.